Okay. Hello, everyone. We're sorry for that technical delay, but we're back. So my name's Joshua New. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation. Uh, I'll be the moderator for this panel, which is titled Open Data, Civic Hacking, and Data-Driven Government. We'll be talking about data innovation from a civic perspective. So with us, we're happy to have Maxime Pechersky, the Chief Data Officer of San Diego, Cam Carey, a Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Brookings Institute, Seamus Kraft, Executive Director and Co-Founder of the OpenGov Foundation, and Mike Flowers, an Urban Science Fellow at the Center for Urban Science and Progress. So this will be a combination of moderated discussion and Q&A from the audience. So if you'd like to participate, please tweet out at the hashtag Data Innovation, and we'll hopefully be able to get to your question. So thank you all to the panelists for being here. And I know we may have said it to nobody a second ago, but so just a brief rundown. Introduce yourself and how, from your perspective, how the open data movement is shaping how government operates. You know, this is something that wasn't even heard of 5 or 10 years ago, and now it's really transformative for local government, particularly, municipal services, government transparency, pretty much down the board. It changes everything.
Sure. Well, why don't I lead off as somebody who dealt with us in government before joining the think tank world and academia at the MIT Media Lab. Law practice, I was at the Commerce Department as the General Counsel, the Acting Secretary. We have a couple of agencies at the Commerce Department, the Census Bureau, NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, that put out huge amounts of data. The census has been in the big data business for over 200 years. George Washington was very concerned about counting up all of our people, getting information on the population. And it's continued to do that. And the computing comes out of, got started from a census employee who automated the counting. But there's been an increased focus on the value of those assets. I think the census data is a foundation for all economic and social science research in the United States. The NOAA data is a foundation for weather services, climate modeling, huge, it really has spawned an industry. We once had a congressman say, what do we need the weather service for? We got the Weather Channel. But all of their information comes from NOAA. I think what's changed in recent years is really a recognition of the value of that. It took me a little bit of time to realize, okay, the Commerce Department, we are a data agency. Secretary Pritzker now has doubled down on that and is appointing the agency's first chief data officer. The Commerce Department now has a data hub. Census Bureau has APIs, visualization tools for ways of providing access to that data. And we're seeing that spawn across other agencies. So you've now got data.gov for a government-wide data hub, and seeing state and local governments emulating that. My own city of Boston has a data hub. It's worked with MIT on a data challenge for how to use that. So it's an increased recognition of what, at least that there are tremendous data assets, that those assets are public goods, and looking at mechanisms, first off, to just make that data available, and more importantly, to exploit it in different ways, really derive information, knowledge, use out of that data.
All right, great, thank you. And Maxime, maybe you can speak to this a bit as well. Cam, you just touched on it, how there's this national open government initiative. Obama famously described it in that same language, that data is a national asset. Do you see a difference between the way the federal government approaches open data and data-driven governments versus on a local level versus city and state government?
Sorry, you said me or Mike? I couldn't hear you.
You.
Oh, me. Okay, cool. So I've actually looked at some of the federal government initiatives, and they seem, the Project Open Data has actually been really helpful in, how policy here in San Diego was shaped, and that's what, kind of convinced some of the higher level leadership to pass it, was that they were kind of providing this framework. Beyond that, I think that data.gov, I've seen some uses of it and some really interesting uses of it, but in terms of the census level, I think a lot of outside of the census level, I think a lot of the data that is getting kind of hacked on and built on, at least in what I'm seeing, tends to be at the local level, and that's kind of some of the more interesting things that are popping up, and I think there's a really good reason for that. It's like I was actually talking with Mike a little bit before the panel, and every place is so different, right? I moved from Oakland just down the coast to San Diego, and it's a completely different world altogether, and, people, the way that the culture works, the way that, people are, the population demographics, and the fact that, we're so close to, Mexico, and then the fact that, you have an upper leadership that's committed to it. There's just so many different factors that are so hyper-local that I think that is why you see a lot of the more interesting things with open data happening at the local level.
Right. All right. So in terms of data-driven government, what are some of the biggest success stories that you have to date? Either, Maxime, I know you've only been the chief data officer for a few months, but are there any projects that you've started to see some results from? Cam, Seamus, and Mike, feel free to join in from around the country or around the world. What are some great ways that open government data has been driving some improved outcomes?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of data-driven government, what I'm seeing now is Mayor Faulconer, he gave a State of the City address, and and some of the things that he was able to say there can now drive some of the performance and analytics measurements that I'm in the performance and analytics department, which is also a really good thing because that is able to join. It's not just data, and it's not just releasing data, but it's actually measuring what's going on. And so the bigger wins that I've personally seen here so far in San Diego, one of the biggest ones has been OpenDSD, which is where they were able to release, at least in terms of internal government, and they released a lot of the permitting information online, and that has decreased their PRA response time, or the time that they spend responding to PRAs by so much. And you hear that so much. We spend so much time responding to PRAs. And I think initially that's going to be kind of one of the biggest ones. The other aspect of it that I'm kind of seeing is there's like a tangent to it that I see in the open source effect, right? Back in the 70s, if you were hacking on some software, you were probably doing it by yourself, right? Or maybe with 10, 15, 20 other people, right? I don't know, I wasn't alive back then. But I'm assuming there's no GitHub, right? And now, when you want to work on a project, anybody who's interested anywhere in the world can join in, right? And I think we're going to start seeing some of that really soon, and I think we actually already are, is that by releasing some of that information and by focusing on managing the information as an asset, we can have a lot more people looking at the data and providing a lot more interesting insights.
So, I mean, just to kind of echo what both Cam and Maxim have said, right? The threshold matter, I couldn't agree more with what Cam was saying. I mean, the census is kind of the original data provider, right, for at least this stuff. It wasn't seen that way. I don't think anybody ever really thought of the census info as leverageable intelligence for a bunch of other things, as a data asset. And it's same goes for the weather. And both those things are so huge in terms of their impact on the day-to-day lives of Americans and companies they're in, and so I think that's enormous. And then the other thing is that I tend not to look at these things as binary. I think some of the things produced by the Commerce Department, when coupled with hyperlocal data, become that much more powerful in terms of the ability to let you do things, right? I do not have a technical background, so I can't speak to whether something being open source or not is as to that I defer on that completely. What I look for is it helping somebody do something, right? And so you're seeing massive efficiency gains in certain cities that are leveraging this kind of federal, state, local synthesis of data to drive their resource allocation for the nuts and bolts things that citizens expect from their government, right? Trash pickup, emergency services, all that stuff, right? And then it's also kind of seeping into the broader. You see a lot of companies that hire thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, heavily relying on this information to do their jobs, to deliver their widgets, whatever that is. That's great, right? Because that's the ecosystem we want to build, and then it just becomes that self-sustaining thing that's going to be necessary to continue to kind of prove over and over again why, what is at core really a transparency effort, to keep that going, right? And I think, an example I can give is that, so I'm after leaving New York, not only am I at NYU, but I'm also with a startup in New York City called Enigma, and we routinely get clients in who want to do things, whether it's manufacturing or finance. And when it comes to American data, we're in great shape, right? There's a lot of things out there that can let you make better loans or build things more effectively, or whatever, right? But when you start going out to other countries, you start seeing the dearth of that information and how hamstrung those countries actually are by not releasing that information and making it available for people to ingest and use and act on, right? So I think that's a really powerful argument right there. That I think where people kind of can tend to run afoul when talking about open data is just kind of thinking about it as just like a data thing, right? When in reality, it's injecting that transparency into anything is invariably going to improve your decision-making process, your resource allocation process, and that ultimately flows to the benefit of the people that live where it is you're delivering those resources and making them more effective. If that makes any sense.
Sure.
So Mike, to that, I think there's certainly I'm hearing increasing recognition elsewhere in the world that they need to make up the gap that you were talking about. Certainly the European Union, as part of its digital agenda, is focusing on data resources. They have a set of privacy issues that they particularly need to deal with. But recently, elsewhere in the world too, I'm part of the World Economic Forum's Data for Development Council, looking at ways that data can help developing countries to jumpstart, and they in Africa in particular. There is a recognition of this issue. The African Union just adopted a convention on data, partly to just realizing that this is a priority. They need policies in place. They need to figure out themselves what are their data assets, what data do they have access to, so that they can jump into this.
Yeah, and I think it takes different forms, right? Certainly, the UK stands out as a shining example.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are other countries. France just appointed a chief data officer, which I thought was pretty significant, and he's a really smart guy, and I look forward to seeing what they come up with. And a couple of other places. I was thinking more in terms of the developing world, like you noted with Africa,
Mm-hmm.
right? One of the most transformative things that could happen, there was a really nifty couple of New York Times articles recently about small business loans, like new applications that are coming out, new platforms that are coming out to facilitate small business loans, right? Leveraging that, as much of that open source intelligence as possible. That's, the more we can inject capital into that market and incentivize and assist our small business owners, the better off everybody is. You see employment increases, you see better tax revenues. That means more policemen and firemen and teachers and schools and all that stuff, right? And so, to the extent that the developing world can start generating something that moves that that moves the development of that ecosystem, the better off that everybody in those developing countries is really going to be. I mean, the only people who really won't be better off are the ones who are benefiting from the incredible asymmetries that currently exist in those places, right? So, and I'm not going to shed a tear for them. So I think that the more that those countries can move towards releasing information to their public, and the more they can permit people to go in and start leveraging that to inject inject capital into the small business market, to inject scrutiny onto, kleptocratic governments, right? All those things are really good, and I think that's something as supportive as I could possibly be of those efforts that you described. I guess I think where we can be of help to them is is showing them where we've botched things, because I don't want to present open data right now as a 100% victory, and we've botched a lot, right? I know I can speak personally from New York's experience. We botched a ton, and it took us a few years before we started getting it, I think, reasonably right. I don't even say we got it right ultimately. By the time I left, I think my successor certainly will, I hope. But I think that there should be more of that sharing, right, or where we screwed up,
Mm-hmm. I'll actually draw a slight tangent from what you were saying, Mike, about small businesses and also, data-driven government wins. And I hate to toot my own horn, but it worked out really well because last year I was a fellow with Code for America, and we were working with Puerto Rico in the area of economic development. And I'm pretty sure this is part of the reason why Mayor Faulconer appointed me, because they're really into economic development in San Diego. And what we were able to do, we were able to build an application that they have 12 economic development agencies on the island, plus they have 78 municipalities with their own economic development agencies, plus they have various nonprofits. So what we were able to do is we were able to centralize all of that into one place. So all of the information or descriptions of these various economic development programs that are being offered are in one place. And the other half of that is what people are searching. People are able to go and actually answer 11 questions. I'm male, I'm under 30 years old, I've been in business for 2 years, I'm making this much money, and my business is making that much money, and get a response, that maybe will match them with like 10 or 12 programs. And out of those 12, maybe there's 5 that they're eligible for, but it's still like 5 out of 12 instead of 5 out of they're not on the internet anywhere, right? But that was kind of the first thing, right? But what, later on, what we realized is now we have all this data about what economic development programs are being offered. And on the other hand, we have all these data points on what economic development programs are being searched for, right? And what are the demographics of the people searching, right? And we're able to take that, and this is kind of the part where, the Puerto Rico government took over because they ran out of fellowship time. But now they're able to take these and compare and see, we're offering a lot of, incentives in this part of the island, but then we're having a lot of searches in this part of the island. Let's see how we can work together across all these different agencies and tailor them to what people are actually looking for. And I think that is, a beginning of a very cool government win, is where you have, because I know with economic development, a lot of the money that gets allocated for it never gets taken up. It never gets given to the businesses. And I think this is a way of kind of like having a data-driven government start looking at, what's being asked for and what do we have, and aligning their offerings to that.
So, Max, you don't want to talk about the things you botched?
Huh?
You know what?
Sorry.
That's
what I'm saying. I
had a follow-up question, though, and what's a very interesting use. Are there ways you can also correlate to outcomes, to progress in economic development.
Right. And I mean, like, talking about things that were botched, actually, there's the things that, I mean, I know I botched some things. I botched some things in how you define a program, right? Like, how do you define an economic development program? And, what are the things that people, like, what are the questions you ask people to get the right data points, right? So I hope we did not botch the concept, because it still seems to be going well. I'm still getting tons of emails.
Mm-hmm.
But what, I think that as this moves on, it's going to need to get adjusted, and it's going to need to get fine-tuned, which is similar to, like, that whole, like, the open data movement in general, right? Like what Mike was saying, and I'll reinforce your point, Mike, is that, we started off, it was kind of bumpy, right? It took a while for you guys to get things right. Hopefully, now that I'm newer, I can kind of work with you guys together and learn from your mistakes, right? And then, the guy that, comes after me, in a different city that is a little bit later down the line, right? He can, or she can, learn even more, right? And I think that's how, yes, we do need to talk about what is being done wrong and what failed. And I agree with you, like, there's not enough of that going on right now.
Yeah, and I think that'll grow with as the security of the concept grows, right? I think you tend to, and politicals are wildly guilty of this, right? But you don't want to talk about your failures, right? Especially when you're talking about something that's new and people are still trying to get their arms around. But the reality is, I think as the concept gets more and more entrenched, and becomes more of a kind of expected way of doing business, then people are going to be perfectly fine with talking about these things. And I think that's it's sort of it'd be ironic, a movement that at its core is really about transparency to the public about what the government's up to. Is not transparent about how badly it's going about its transparency effort, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong. You make mistakes, people go forward, but I think that conceptually, it's all good stuff, and it's moving along really well. I mean, I'm pretty happy. I think some stuff on the horizon I'm seeing from some cities is really exciting, right? Like, New Orleans, I think, is really doing some really fascinating stuff in terms of nuisance abatements and things like that, and redeveloping the post-Katrina and whatnot. A number of other places that I've kind of taken a look at. I think these are just pure wins for the public. That when their tax dollars are allocated more effectively to improve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So I just I don't see that. To me, it's not binary that you share that which is going off the rails. In order to continue to improve, what's staying on the rails.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that a lot of the creativity would be at the municipal level. It's a smaller scale lab. I think when you're talking about something like the NOAA data, the census data, if you're really going to commercialize that, you're talking about something that's on a very large scale, but. At the municipal level, there really are the opportunities to do things as Boston's done, as San Diego's done, to have a hackathon, spend a day or two focusing on a few data sets and coming up with some useful applications.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't it also speak to the differences between those two government entities? I mean, at the federal level, it's far more programmatic, right? The states, the cities, excuse me, are extremely transactional. The federal government doesn't pick up the trash. They'll clean up a Superfund site, but they're not going to send out trash trucks every day, right?
Yeah.
So it makes total sense to me that it's different.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things they did in Boston, the White House Big Data Report talked about this, was using mobile phones and the sensors and accelerometers to identify potholes. That's uniquely a municipal thing.
So I want to. Those are all great responses. Thank you. I know we could talk all day about this, so maybe we'll come back to it. But so I want to address a question that came up on Twitter, and I want to engage Seamus a bit. So one of the questions we had is how do you engage more people that aren't strictly data science people, that aren't super technically literate necessarily, but want to participate in this sort of open government process? Seamus, I know the Open Gov Foundation regularly posts to GitHub. I know you do yourself, Maxim. What are the benefits of kind of opening up this whole forum for civic engagement that didn't exist even just a couple years ago? What kind of results are you seeing from that? Seamus? Looks like we're having some trouble hearing you. Nope, still can't hear you. Maxime, if you wanted to talk on that a bit while we maybe get him online.
Sure. So civic engagement, like can you repeat the question? Sorry, I was just a little bit. I want to make sure I get that.
Sure. So the whole open government movement and the open source movement allows for a whole host of people to participate in improving government that there was no avenue for even a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
How do you engage people that aren't necessarily on the front lines doing data science and hacking and making the app to improve government, or that aren't within government itself, but they're experts, they're knowledgeable, and they're willing to participate? How do you get them on board? I know GitHub is a great avenue for that, but so how are you seeing that factor into data-driven government?
So I'll actually, I'll kind of give an example that's myself, right? And even before I was in Code for America, or even before I was looking at any of this stuff, is back in Chicago, I got a parking ticket, and it was like one of those, like I'm sure Mike knows from New York, we have like a pole with like 5 different parking signs, and it becomes a math equation of where you can park and where you can't, right? And I was, I was really upset about it, right? And I went and I paid my fine, and then I was angry, right? I was really, really upset that like they found me guilty anyway, and this is stupid, and why do I have to do math to figure out this equation, right? And I also happen to be a developer, right? I never really paid attention to government. I did not know who my council member was, right? And it's not like after getting a parking ticket I went to go find out. But, I think it was around that time that either right before or right after I stumbled onto the OpenGov Hack Night, right? Now, the OpenGov Hack Night, what they were doing at the time is it was on the south side of downtown, whereas I worked on the north side of downtown, so trying to drive downtown at 6 o'clock in the afternoon on a Wednesday, I think they had it, Tuesday, I can't remember, is not happening, right? But, I do like to stay up at night and write code, right? And I think GitHub was a perfect way for me to, commit some of my time when it was convenient for me, right? Instead of saying, I have to be there at this time and I have to show up and that's the only way I can participate. And I think those are the subtle avenues of engagement that, one, it would drive for a much more engaged citizen population, right? But why do we want them engaged in the first place? Well, because we want them to stay, right? Like, like the ultimate disengagement from city government is actually getting so upset with your city government that you decide this is not working for me, I'm going to move away, right? And I think that at that point is when we really, we've not done our job. And different people will engage at different levels, and I think kind of like what we're seeing now, what we're seeing with this movement, GitHub's being one of them. Some people are not at GitHub, that's fine. They're not programmers, they're not nerds. That's why you have things being built on top of Twitter. You kind of have to go and meet people where they are, and I think that, and that's where you kind of find the tech literate people. Like, don't expect people to come to GitHub, don't expect people to come to your app, don't expect people to come to your website. You kind of have to understand where the people are and go there. And, a lot of times, like, open data kind of provides that avenue because the average government employee may not have the time, or it may not even be on his or her radar to make that connection. Whereas, somebody that's bothered just enough to make, to like hit that target point can figure that out.
Sure. That's great. And Seamus, did you want to talk about some of the OpenGov foundations, maybe their Project Madison that is kind of open engagement from not necessarily a technical perspective? If we can, still having trouble hearing you. All right. Well, if you want to tweet us at with the hashtag innovation, I can get your response. We'll give you an opportunity to comment later. I'm sorry it's not working out. Moving on. Cam, so we talked a little bit about how open data was being used in developing countries. How is it being used specifically for humanitarian purposes? And this is not necessarily just government data, but private sector data as well. How do you leverage the two to deliver aid faster, improve quality of life, and things like that? How is that being used today that you couldn't do years ago?
Yeah, I mean, the best source has been mobile data. So these are not data-rich countries, but there are over 80 cell phones per 100 people in the population. So a lot of the work has been working with carriers to use mobile metadata to look at exactly the kind of questions that you're talking about. But the movements that you get from that help with transportation planning. We worked on a project with folks at MIT and the Gates Foundation, looking at humanitarian uses, particularly disease migration. So you can track malaria risk. You can track Ebola risk, and there's been a lot of effort put to try to get some of that data, to pool it and put it to work for that purpose. I think some of the challenges are that public policies are lagging to ensure that there's a legal framework that lets people do that. There are challenges of privacy issues. How do you make this data available, but ensure that it's not used for evil purposes? You can think of look back in Rwanda 20 years ago and think about the consequences of being able to map populations and movements of populations at that time. There's a number of things that need to be addressed, and I think to create some mechanisms to pool the data to ensure that it's used for the right purposes. And perhaps, and this is something to explore, is how do you make the data available so it can be used for research, so you can query the data and get useful information from it, but protect the raw data so that you can't identify people and use it for other purposes that we want to avoid.
Great. So Seamus, it looks like you're back. I want to give you a chance to speak a little bit. So if you want to talk about some of the OpenGov Foundation's kind of public engagement works, the Madison Project, posting on GitHub, things like that.
Sure. So can you hear me now?
Yes, thankfully.
We can.
Hooray for technology. This is ironic, but now we're back. So the OpenGov Foundation and my outfit here, we're a nonprofit. We focus on lawmaking, and legislation. So the words, the textual part of all of these data sets. And we got our start inside of Congress, crowdsourcing legislation. It seems like a no-brainer today, right? We crowdsource knowledge with Wikipedia, we crowdsource and share work with Google Docs, but we don't do it for our nation's most important data sets, which are our state, local, and federal laws, legislation, and regulation. So we hacked open that process. You can check it out at keepthewebopen.com. But where we are right now is taking that from the federal level down. We tried a state, and that state shall remain nameless, but they weren't ready for something like this. So I think the leap from talking about open data in the ways that we've been talking about it to citizen participation is a very, very big one, and there have been plenty of mistakes and mess-ups that we've made along the way. Now, and that's why I got my Chicago Blackhawks hat on here, we're down working with the hotbeds of civic innovation, which really are the municipalities. It's just so much easier to succeed at a local level. There's no partisanship, or very little partisanship. There's a greater need, and the service delivery and the actual work that you do and the end user are sometimes right outside and right down the street. So that's what we've been working on, and there's certainly a long way to go.
All right, great, thank you. And so I want to do one last question. We've got about 5 minutes left. A question from Twitter. How can you standardize data sets across dispersed local governments? Is data not always available? Are there formatting issues? Is it maybe not machine readable? Or are there other technical barriers in place? Or are there policy barriers? Are there attitude barriers? What's stopping this? Or what would be a solution going forward to kind of make all these data sets interoperable across from one city to the next?
That's a great question. I can jump in on it actually, because this is what we do with decoded laws, with municipal, state, and federal laws, legislation, and regulation. We're opening up heretofore paper-based or frames-based, 1997 level web access to modern web design, responsiveness, and APIs, bulk downloads, all of the things that one would come to expect in the year of our Lord 2015. But each city does it their own way. Each codifier does it their own way. Most cities and states don't even make this information themselves. They hire vendors to come do it. Each vendor has their own proprietary format that's a decade or more out of date. And on top of that, many states or municipalities mandate information in a certain way. And then there's the cultural component. What plays in Peoria is very different than what works in Wichita. And so bridging that just cultural gap is another massive thing that we need to do. But I think if there's one simple thing we could say about this information is to focus on one data set and then do it as nationally as possible. We've picked laws and legislation. To do that, we're building a schema. We're building a drafting environment, a way to create this information, ways to track it and collaborate on it throughout the process, and then a way to access it at the end. Just like you pull a law book off the shelf, you can access the law through our open source project. Okay, that's one of thousands of different data sets that city governments are working on. Let's focus on one of those instead of trying to handle everything at the same time.
The only thing I would add to that is, government is not a monolith, right? Everyone, it's composed of a bunch of different agencies, and those agencies also speak their own languages, and they have their own cultures and their own reasons for doing what they do, and it's a mashup of technological and statutory slash regulatory driven slash resources and culture, right? So what I've tended not to do when I was with New York anyway was sort of try to impose from above a format, right? What I was more interested in is, okay, just make it raw and make it available, right? And if we can, when we're talking about making it public, put it into an API, which sort of, because at that point then I think, they'll be, depending on what people want to do with it, they'll be able to, have the raw Legos to play with and snap together their insights, right? But then you also have to, the one thing that it doesn't get talked about very much, and I think really needs to, is that simply releasing the data alone, without any kind of understanding of what that data, what reality that data purports to represent, is the road to ruin. If somebody is trying to use that to make interpretations, right? I mean, to some degrees, far less than others. Certain statutory releases like were just described, that's a lot more difficult to misconstrue, right? A statute, all lawyers speak statute to a certain degree, right? But when I'm talking about, like the ontologies that New York City uses, for example, about where am I, right? You can get into a really philosophical conversation about what any of that means. I mean, when the Department of Finance answers the question of where am I, they're either they're wearing that hat in order to collect a bill, and usually there's a mail address involved or a tax lot, right? But if you ask the fire department where am I, it's going to be a much different mission-driven answer, right? Because they got to get to like the 36th floor of the Empire State Building, and and that at that point you're talking about a latitude and longitude and a z-axis, right? So, and then that's leaving behind the regulatory underpinning of much of this data. Some of this, a good chunk of municipal data anyway, is generated not just for operational purposes, but because there's a statute or a regulation mandating that it be collected, right? And unless you understand the evil that was sought to be remedied by that regulation or statute, you're not going to understand how to interpret that data. And so there's a million things that need to happen, right? Or a million different things that kind of can get embedded in each data point that aren't really fully understood by the public.
Mike, that was great. And on that note, we got about 30 seconds left before the next panel starts on the Internet of Things. So a big thank you to all our panelists today. This will be posted directly to YouTube after it's done, and feel free to watch it on our website. So thank you for participating, and we hope you stay with us for our next panels.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.